Ready, Michele? Okay. So I'll start saying a few general words. So my name is Luis Betancourt. I'm the director of the Mansueto Institute. So I want to welcome you to our lunchtime colloquium series. Today we'll have sort of a dive deep in time with Michele Massa. I'll tell you a little bit about his work and where it fits in the context of sort of the Institute and urban science. So as many of you know, cities have taken many forms through history and continue to take many forms throughout the world. And one of the very important dimensions of understanding what cities are and what they do is to look through history, where we can see a lot more variation, a lot more contextual adaptation, different political systems, different economic systems, and yet you have cities. So it's very important to kind of hold this variation in mind when we think about what's essential and what's not about even present-day cities, if that's your focus, but also, of course, gives us a window into our own humanity and how it has changed over time. So it's sort of a local speciality here at UChicago, particularly through the Oriental Institute that studied sort of the early cities of the Middle East, to precisely do that and do sort of comparative analysis of cities through history with landscape archaeology, and also with the celebrated work of Bob Adams, who was once director of the Institute and also provost. So in that tradition, if you may remember, is sort of the mother of all great experiments, which compares urbanization in Mesopotamia, perhaps some of the earliest cities in Mesopotamia, to the cities of Mesoamerica. So extending a bit that work in that spirit, we've continued our collaboration now with the Mansueto Institute and the Oriental Institute. And the fulcrum of that collaboration is Michele Massa. So let me introduce you to him. He's an expert also in a type of Middle Eastern early urbanism, but really focused, is going to tell you in detail, but focused a little bit further north on Anatolia, so today's mostly Turkey, where a bit in parallel, but also independently from Mesopotamia, an urban system was developing. Michele has been involved in creating some of the best data aggregations and surveys of that area, and understanding how it developed vis-a-vis its natural environment, but also how it created sort of a system of settlements in an urban system. So, so this is very much in the spirit of, I think, where a lot of urban science applied to history is going, in bringing together sort of modern methods of data and analysis and comparative analysis with sort of the best scholarship in archaeology. So I'm delighted to introduce Michele. Michele has a PhD from UCL London, Institute of Archaeology, and was a postdoc before coming to us in Turkey and at the British Institute in Ankara. So without much further ado, I already talked too much. Michele, it's a great pleasure to have it with us at the Institute, and also to have it with us today for this talk. So take it away.
Thank you, Rich, very much for the kind introduction. Let me start sharing the screen. Well, you said it all already, Luis. I don't have to talk about my presentation today. As Luis was mentioning, this is going to be a slightly different Mansueto lunch colloquium talk than usual, in the sense that it is going back in time, and it is also less quantitative than most talks that are presented within this framework. I am actually working toward making my research a little bit more quantitative with the help of people from the Institute. But this year I just started, and my postdoc started in September. So in a sense, I hope you will take it as a proof of concept of what my ideas are, and what I can do. And we were discussing a couple of weeks ago with the other Mansueto fellows, is doing interdisciplinary work is hard, and it is very, very welcome challenge, but it's also hard to sort of talk with people that have different sort of frameworks in mind. So I try today to make it as comprehensible as possible without being too simplistic, and I hope I sort of hit the right middle ground here. So what my project at Mansueto is about is essentially looking at how ancient cities in time impacted on their natural and human environments around them. So sort of presenting a complementary perspective on urban studies, where most urban studies look at the inside of mechanism of urbanization, while with this project, I'm trying to look at outside. So what is the relationship between cities and villages around them, cities and the ecosystems they are embedded in? And before moving on, I would like to say a few words on why is archaeology relevant to urban studies. And Luis said already in part, and what I would like to stress is that archaeology shows us a society or societies that had a much lower systemic complexity. And because of that, it is much easier in a way to understand the underlying patterns in processes. And because, and I noticed that even more during other people presenting at the Mansueto talks, is we have much fewer data sets, and it's incredibly smaller amount of data set compared to what normal urban scientists work with. And if there is a lot of limitation with that, it also comes with a higher ability to synthesize and model the data set, because we can actually get them in their entirety. And also, as also Luis was mentioning, the diachronicity that archaeology provides allows tracing the development of processes along long time scales. And, you know, it is like, I like to compare archaeology with sort of a collective psychotherapy. You understand your problems when you look at how they were created in the first place. So archaeology is a bit like this. You know, I like to think about it. And it is a perfect arena to try to understand what resilience and sustainability are in the long term. And I will talk a little bit more about that as well. And you know, compared to modern urban context, where you know the researcher is very much embedded in the political, cultural, social context of of that city, being an archaeologist allows, at least for some distance. I mean, we're also political animals, but there is a lot of, you know, politics also involved in archaeology. But at least it allows a step back from the political fray, if you wish. So before moving on into the fray, I wanted to set the stage of where my research area is in the world. It is in Turkey, which is classified by the Panel for Climate Change as a semi-arid area region. So it is a fragile landscape that will become even more fragile in the next few decades. And you can see here a bit more in detail, this is Western and Central Turkey, and the Konya Plain, where my study is actually the driest area today and in the past of Anatolia. And if we zoom even further, what we have here is a plain which is bounded by these mountains, the Taurus Mountains and the Bos Mountains. And it is an endorheic basin. So it means that all the water flowing from the mountains collects in the center of the plain and evaporates or goes into groundwater table. And we will see why this is important. There is no outlet to the sea. And around this, alluvial fans created by these rivers, we have steppe, so semi-arid steppe-land. And we have three main sites here, which I will mention across the talk. One is Çatalhöyük, which is one of the oldest farming villages in the world. It starts around 7,500 BC, and Turkey, as Wish was mentioning, is on the periphery of the Fertile Crescent. And so it is within the sort of core of early sedentarism, plant and animal domestication. And Çatalhöyük is very much one of the most important sites to understand this. And then you see Konya and Turkmenkara, which are the two cities across time that existed not at the same time, one or the other existed in the last 5,000 years in the Konya Plain. And Konya in particular is one of the oldest continuously occupied cities in the world, with a history of settlements spanning at least 5,500 years. So we will see them in more detail now. So the first part of my talk will be about trying to understand how political landscape develop and the structuring of political landscapes across time. And I will give a very impressionistic view. I mean, you probably are used to much more granular data sets than archaeologists are. So it is painted with a very broad brush. And a big problem that I have, but we as archaeologists have in general, at least in the Middle East, is that archaeologists don't like to collect data over the last 2,000 years. They don't consider that as part of archaeology. So I don't have, unfortunately, access myself to those data. We were not given the permit for the project that I'm conducting in this area. We're not given the permit to study these periods. So unfortunately, it's a bit lacking. But I started another project, I co-direct another project, which is called Fragile Landscape, which is about the last 500 years of the Konya Plain, looking at water management and looking at the sort of political and economical history of the region. So I will talk about this as well. And before we sort of go into the detail of political landscape here, I just wanted to make sure we are on the same sort of idea of what we of cities and how do we as archaeologists define cities. You see here I tried to collect a sort of a list of correlates of how archaeologists define ancient cities. And what I would like to stress is that urbanism and urbanizations are a continuous process. It's not something that at some point stops, and also there isn't a precise moment where it starts even. I mean, it is a degree of complexity that we're trying to capture in archaeology. And to sort of show this, so that the columns here are actually different historical periods. And so I tried to sort of suggest with the plus signs how much of that specific parameter it is present in any specific moment. So you can see here it's actually difficult to pinpoint with precision when cities appear. But if you have to corner me, I would say for Turkey, for Central Anatolia, for the area that I'm dealing with, is probably around 2000 BCE. And so we start here. So you see the Konya Plain here. You see in black the sort of archaeological settlements we know of. We see the rivers, and we see the wetlands around the plain. And what I'm showing here is the location of the earliest sedentary settlements that we know. And these are the earliest communities that decided to settle down and to sort of live an agro-pastoral life. And around them, for sure, there were more mobile communities, for which is more difficult to find evidence for. So these are, let's say, the first communities, and there were probably between 200 and 1,000 people at the most in this period. And as we move on, we see that with better techniques for farming, with more adaptive behavior, we see that these communities thrive and they start settling in other sides, in other areas of the landscape. And at the end of the 4th millennium, this is where Konya starts as a small village. And at the same time, we start seeing across Turkey, across Anatolia, the beginning of social stratification. We see evidence for labor specialization. We see evidence for small differences, social differences in status between people in the same community. And in the 3rd millennium is, however, really when things start to become complex in terms of social complexity. We see the beginning of relatively large centers between 5,000 and 10,000 people. And here in the Konya Plain, you see that there is quite a lot of them, and they are competing with each other. We have a lot of evidence for armed conflicts, for interpersonal violence, not only in the Konya Plain, but across Anatolia in this period. And so this is when different communities start competing for resources. At the end of this period is really when urban centers start to coalesce from these competing centers. And so this, around 2000 BC, is when Konya becomes the first city. Excavations at Konya revealed that there is a palace structure at the center of the settlement with evidence for central administration, and there is also writing. And Konya is probably the earliest city-state in the region, and is at least controlling a part of the Konya plain, if not the whole. And that it might have had competing city-states in one or more of these centers in this area here as well. What we know from text is that the earliest name of Konya was Ikuwania, and through various iterations, it actually Roman Iconium, Ottoman Konya, to present-day Konya. At the end of the Middle Bronze Age, which was this phase here, Konya is destroyed by an enemy attack, and the power balance shifts to a new rising city, which is Turkmenkarayuk. And Turkmenkarayuk is at some point part of the Hittite kingdom, so an overarching state occupying most of central Anatolia and beyond. And so it becomes an administrative capital for this region. And when this happens, we start seeing a more complex hierarchical structure. And so we see that the secondary center are more evenly spaced with each other compared to previous periods. And so this is the third millennium, and this is the late second millennium. So you see that there are fewer centers beyond the city. And this process continues into the first millennium BCE, when Turkmenkarayuk remains the capital center for the region. And at the end of around 500 BC, when the whole region becomes part of the Persian Empire, we see really the emergence of a phenomenon that we'll talk a bit later, but of rural hinterlands. So of newly founded settlements, which are specialized in producing food for the city and the major centers. Unfortunately, here, when things start to get interesting, our archaeological records ends. But we know from estimated guess and from historical texts that Konya, after this period, returns to be the only city in the plain, and for the last 2,500 years is the only sort of large agglomeration in the area. So this is sort of the same concept expressed in a bar chart. You see here the amount of settled area in hectares on the vertical axis, and here you have the progressive phases on the horizontal axis. And what you see here is that hamlet and villages, they are there from the very beginning, but in the third millennium we have the first big centers, and then we have the first cities around 2000 BC, and with the first cities, which are approximately 10 to 20,000 inhabitants. So this is the sort of scale you have to think of it. But they were fully fledged cities. So there is bureaucracy, there is a system of taxation, and also military obligations. So corvées that commoners had to fulfill yearly or maybe every 5 years. And how does this compare, for instance, with the later period? We don't have a clear picture of what happens in the rural Konya after this. Oh, sorry. Let me first discuss. We don't have a full picture of what happens in rural Konya, but what we do know is that there is a shift in the type of settlement. So from mounded settlements, which are these ones, to flat sites. And mounded settlements are very compact settlements. So you see here individual houses, and they share walls, they share living spaces. So this is the courtyard. They have a very communal way of life, because everybody could listen to everybody, everybody could watch everybody. There were a lot of activities together. The households were very small, nuclear families, 4 to 6 people, and the population density were extremely high, at least compared to modern standards. this is to remind you, however, that fewer places were more than 1,000, 2,000 people. So the high density was allowed by the relatively small size of the community. And so these settlements are typical or phases before the Hellenistic period, before Konya is part of imperial entities. And why do we call them mounds? It's because they actually are artificial mounds created by the accumulation of debris, of building debris over time. And in some cases, they reach it up to 20, 30 meter high. So this is the typical site for pre-classical, pre-Hellenistic Konya. And in times, what we see after that period is that villages started to shift from the top of the mount to the plain, and they start to have a very different sort of layout. And because we don't have any excavated example, it's just an approximation here, but you see on the right, you see a medieval sort of flat side, and you see here on the left a modern traditional settlement. And I think that these are individual mounds. Each circle is an individual mound, which more or less represent to an individual farmstead. So modern, medieval and modern units, if you wish, are large extended family living in a big house with a courtyard, and they are independent one from another. They are much more separated, and also the density is much lower. And this is, I think, and it's not only my opinion, I think it represents two very different ways of interacting inside a community and producing. And so this is in a graph how the shift happens. It's not sudden shift. And again, it becomes more prominent around the 5000 BCE. We don't have the archaeological evidence for what happens after that, but we have in other areas of the Near East the same process, and we know from this analysis that this process continue into the sort of 19th century, into the 19th century. So as I was saying before, I think it reflects a shift from self-sufficient communities that were doing essentially everything inside that community to rural interland that are specialized in food production and that are entirely or more dependent on big centers for sort of pottery, for anything that is a sort of specialized labor. And this clearly happens in the context of very complex political entities. Contemporary, probably even earlier than this process, we start seeing an urban drift. So what we see is that when the first cities start to appear, we start to see a concentration in these cities and in the secondary centers of power, specialized manufacture, and art, and luxury goods, and evidence for inter-regional exchange. I cannot show you a very good example archaeologically from the Konya region because it would take too long, but I think that 16th century Konya is a good proxy in this sense. And we now started a new project looking at, among other things, the tax records from the Ottoman state, and they are incredibly detailed about everything that is taxable. And what they tell us is that most of these villages, these dots are individual villages, they are simply producing food, wheat and barley mostly. And only Konya has a really large range of professions that exist there, including, sword makers, goldsmiths, etc. So there is a concentration of specialization in Konya. And also what we see is that there is a concentration of religious activity. We have a lot of mosques. We also have a synagogue and a couple of churches I forgot to mention. And we have open markets. So like in medieval Europe, the city here is where people gather at regular intervals to sort of get commodities that they wouldn't be able to get in the village. And just again, impressionistically, to show that Konya is also an important center of culture. well, Konya was, thanks to Rumi. Rumi was one of the most important medieval poets in the Islamic world. And he created the Mevlana, which is the center of a spiritual sect called the Sufi, which was thriving in the medieval and Ottoman Konya. So again, very impressionistically, this is the approximate size of urban population in Konya from the beginning, from its foundation until today. And you will see that we don't have as many data points for earlier parts, but it gives you, I think, a very good understanding of the sheer scale of modern cities compared to ancient cities. So, you know, Ikuwania, so around 2000 BC, this is when Konya becomes a city. This around 13th century is when it becomes the capital of a state, which so the population increases. But then during the Ottoman time and until the creation of the Republic around the early 20th century, it was a very important regional capital. So for most of its history, despite the fact being an important regional center, the population stayed very low compared to modern time, between 15 and 30,000 people. And when really things start to change is when, with the Republic, Turkish Republic, Atatürk, Mustafa Kemal Pasha, the leader of early Republican Turkey, introduces, Turkey enters the industrial era. And so you can see that there is a spike in the population. And, you know, between the mid-19th century and today is a 60-fold increase, which is dramatic. We don't have the same sort of granularity for rural population, but there is also a very big increase in the rural population as well. And here you can see it on a map, what 19th century Konya looked like here and what it looks today. And the causes for this exponential growth are, in my opinion, like mainly four. One is antibiotics, which, and more generally improvement in medical science, which really extended lifespan, but more importantly, tremendously cut down mortality rates in children. So before antibiotics, there were around 20–30% of children were dying in the first year of their life. And with antibiotics, this really stopped very quickly, allowing population growth. And mechanized agriculture also allowed for enormously expanding the ability to produce food in the same sort of area. While manufacture and resource extraction allowed to provide for this increasing population, and transport, enormous improvement in transport technology allowed to move resources around with ease. So how does this tie in with my second part of the talk, which is about how much this impacted on the landscapes? And here I'm going to talk about a term that probably most of you are familiar with, the Anthropocene, which is the idea that Anthropocene is a geological epoch, is the epoch of humanity, of humankind. And the idea is that human impact on the environment is so high that it leaves a trace in the geological record. So originally coined to sort of express the post-atomic era, 1950s and later, gradually archaeology started to appropriate this term and started to bring it back to earlier periods. And many argue, and I am with them, that this process starts already at the beginning of the Neolithic, around 8,000, 10,000 BCE. And I will try to convince you of that. How do we measure this? Well, the most important source actually are lake sediments, because they give us an enormous amount of information about sedimentation rates and therefore erosion around in the surrounding catchment basin. They give us understanding of temperature. They give us understanding of evapotranspiration, and they also are very good at trapping pollen from plants from the surrounding areas. And because these sediments are laminated, we can date them with a high precision. So sediments that are spanning, let's say, 10,000 years, they give us a very accurate picture of what the changing environment around them is. And the second source of information is actually from excavation. We collect and study and statistically analyze plant and animal remains, and we can see changing through time, at least of plant and animals that come in contact with humans. And so what we see here is that, at least starting with the sort of the early sedentary settlements, we see the expansion of agricultural activities. And we don't know exactly how they look like, but this is a sort of medieval field system around a village. And because radial systems are the most efficient when you don't have a tractor, it is probably similar also in earlier periods. So we have to imagine 1 or 2 kilometer radius of fields around each site, each settlement. And you see in time, so this is 7,500 BC, in time, sort of the Konya plain starts to fill up with settlements, and therefore by the end of it, we have a sort of agricultural landscape rather than a natural one. And so the impact of agriculture is topsoil erosion, loss of biodiversity, because farmers tend to weed out plants they don't like, or they are not beneficial to them or to their animals. And deforestation to leave space for fields. And also in contemporary, we see that when animal husbandry started to become a prominent economic activity, we see the impact of grazing on already fragile landscapes of the Konya plain, which were already steppe. And what we see is that animals start to feed on tender grasses, and they're leaving aside thorny grasses, which become predominant in the pollen record. And sort of around the Bronze Ages, this is when we start seeing the extinction of large mammals in the area, either because they are hunting domesticated animals, or because they are competing with domesticated animals, or simply because they are a source of food, and so that they are driven to extinction already very early on. And another source of impact is really deforestation, which serves a variety of purposes, including fuel, including material for building, but also, as I was mentioning earlier, to sort of leave space for agriculture. And we see this on the pollen record already starting in the mid-late third millennium. And from the mid-second millennium, we see encroaching agricultural fields high in the mountains. And we see the spread of domesticated tree species for horticulture. So very much a landscape which is becoming humanized, a cultural landscape rather than a natural one. And a very important case study for deforestation, not only in Turkey, but across the Mediterranean, is well-documented deforestation of the Taurus Mountain, especially the southern side of the Taurus Mountain here, which was famed in antiquity for the presence of cedar trees, which were perfect for shipbuilding. And when this area becomes under the control of the Roman Empire, this is when we start seeing, and most of the Roman fleet, Roman Navy, was built out of these trees, and we see a drastic decrease in vegetation cover. And we also see here, for example, this is the period immediately preceding it with all the settlements, and here we see the Roman settlement. So you see how they clearly encroach, at least on the lower slopes of the Taurus Mountains, specifically to tap onto this resource. And this is followed by a large-scale abandonment of this area because it was no longer sustainable. And another source of deforestation is actually metal mining, of which Anatolia is dotted with. So across the Taurus Mountains specifically, there is large deposits of copper, gold, silver, and tin, which were used already in the Bronze Ages. And we see that that is sort of in parallel with evidence for deforestation. And actually, in the 17th century, we have textual evidence mentioning that the area around the Sysma mining district was completely treeless because of mining, because smelting copper, for instance, required large amounts of fuel. And actually, being part of empires also had a toll on of the variety of diversity of crops, because when there is a centralized administration, administrators want to get taxable crops. So taxes were either expressed in silver or more commonly in wheat and barley. And we see this again in the Ottoman records, that the vast majority of production in the Konya Plain in the 16th century was wheat and barley. And possibly what is the most impactful activity in the Konya Plain, at least, is a large-scale hydrographic modification. So irrigation systems, essentially, and reservoirs and drainage. And we start seeing this geologically already around the third millennium, where when the river flows is regimented, and the Charshamba River, which is the main river at the center of the plain, no longer floods. So this is a good indication that they were using flood management, at least. But during the Persian period, around 500 BC and later, we see the sort of colonization of what were steppe by sedentary settlements. And this is, we think that it is related with large-scale irrigation systems. And other forms of water management are dams, which the earliest example, which is actually almost more than 3,000 years old, you can see on the left. And another example is field terracing on the lower slopes of mountains to catch sort of the water runoff. So it retains humidity on the slopes, but of course is subtracted from the lowlands. And this is normally associated with wine and also grape and olive cultivation. The scale, however, of this modification is really changes with the sort of industrialization period that I was mentioning before. And so the Konya Plain is one of the earliest examples of large-scale irrigation systems across the Middle East. And during the late years of the Ottoman Empire, German engineers were tasked with creating a sort of systematic irrigation network in the plain. So this is a pre-irrigation system, and this is the modern irrigation system, and you see the sheer scale. And what this has contributed to, among other things, is drying up of the wetlands, the large amount of wetland that existed in the Konya Plain. And another contributing factor is the construction of deep water wells that tapped into the groundwater table. Because since the 1970s, they started cultivating water demanding sugar beet, which was totally inappropriate for the Konya Plain. And that meant a lowering of the water table significantly, to the extent that large parts of the basin are now becoming desertified, and there are huge problems with sinkholes appearing everywhere. And the second most important impact of human activity on the landscape today are quarries and mines, essentially coal mines, marble quarries, which are significantly reshaping the mountain specifically. So before coming to an end, I'm struggling at the moment to quantify this and to bring it sort of organically in a comparative way. So I will try to find ways, not necessarily I will be able to, but at least in a semi-quantitative way. But there is a clear loss of biodiversity from the Neolithic to the present, which is, I think, associated with an increase in population, in technology capabilities, but also in political complexity. So instead of conclusions, I would like to end with final thoughts, because I'm not at the stage of providing any sort of conclusion, but some ideas of what I've learned so far. And what is, I think, is striking with this example put all together is the public opinion is very much bought into the idea that we are undergoing a global climate crisis. And I think that fewer people than maybe 10 years ago are not convinced of this. But there is much less talk about the enormous impact that human activity has on the local environments, and the looming catastrophe that we're facing, and especially in semi-arid regions like the Konya Plain, where the system is already fragile, naturally fragile, and with increasing temperature and with the sort of human pressure that we've seen, are bound to collapse in the very recent future. And also, we are very wary as archaeologists, and it's very difficult in archaeology anyway, to sort of demonstrate causality in any sort of process that we see. But I think that there is a clear correlation between the increase in complexity and population and technology with the amount of evidence for environmental modification that we have through time. So I think that part of my project will try to bring me closer to sort of prove this causality, especially over the last 50 years, 70 years. So in a sense, counterbalancing the brilliant idea, and an idea that I really love of Luis, of cities being social reactors and bringers of good and of innovation. I also sort of want to add that yes, but it is also they are sort of attracting and eating away all sorts of resources from their hinterlands, and I think we shouldn't forget that from an administrative perspective, the decision makers are almost always in cities, and they have a biased perspective, of course, of what is good for a city and what is good for the non-city dwellers. And also, we see this progressive ability of central places to concentrate and extract resources, taxes, but also skilled individuals from the hinterlands. And so I would like to leave you with a final thought, sort of, how do we measure sustainability when we talk about sustainable cities? It's really about being greener and having a better quality of life, simply that. And also, when we mean, who do we mean? Sustainable for whom? For the urban dwellers, for the rural dwellers, for the industrialized world, for animal and plants, for the landscapes around us. And with this, I conclude. And I would like to thank really a lot Luis Betancourt and Chris Woods, the directors of the Mansueto and the Oriental Institutes, to allow me to come here to test my ideas here. This is a great opportunity for me, and I'm very grateful for you. And thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Michele. That's great. Very interesting, study and data set, and lots of questions. So I think we have a few questions. I'm going to get right into that, and then maybe we can have a little discussion at the end. So I think we had questions from Scott Artman. Good to see you, Scott. Thanks for being here. And Hervé also. Maybe Scott, could you jump in, and then I'll ask Hervé to do so later.
Sure. Well, thanks for inviting me to attend, and thanks for your talk, Michele. I was really struck by your graph where you showed that around 2000 BC, the overall settled area of the Konya Plain declined even as the first city there took shape. I wondered what you thought about that pattern, whether there's evidence of a declining population at that period of time with people moving out, or more evidence of a concentration of the people who are there into a smaller overall footprint. It seems to me like the latter may potentially hint at some directions for thinking about the degree to which environmental impacts change with the density of settlement in an area.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, well, to begin with, something that I couldn't really talk about is that at the end of the third millennium, when you see the drop, is also because there is a known sort of drought or series of drought spells across the Near East. And we see that different areas are impacted differently. There are different social responses. I mean, all sorts of questions. But I think in the Konya Plain, what also happens is there is an abandonment of some of the more marginal areas, so that they're not living there sedentarily anymore. They might go into the bigger centers. Yes, that is a possibility. Or they may also start leading a more mobile way of life, at least temporarily. Or they move to the highlands, which is a recurring pattern in the Konya Plain. When there is a problem, they sort of go to the highlands, which is more secure, and at least there is a sort of better, more stable environment. But definitely, I think that inurbation or like a conurbation is a coalescence into larger urban places is a possibility. I mean, the problem that we have is calculating population, right? Is because we know approximately how small sites are in terms of density, because there are a lot of excavated examples, but there are very few cities that are excavating such an extent that then allow us to tell what is the urban density. And I think it's lower because as communities grow in size, the need for distancing is higher overall. So I think that urban densities are lower than the village densities. Did it answer?
Mm-hmm. Thanks, interesting.
It's interesting relative to the Maya case that you were looking at, right, Scott? Possibly, it's a thought. Hervé, do you want to jump in and ask you a question?
Yeah, hi, Michele, nice to see you. Yeah. Nice to see you, Luis, too, and everyone. It's actually, my question ties a little bit on that of Scott's, because I was struck by your graph where you show that, you know, the balance between mounded settlements and small-scale flat sites, and that huge increase. And I think I mean, I'm not saying that's not a thing. I think it's fairly clear throughout the Near East that, you know, in the Hellenistic period and onwards, we have this expansion of those flat sites in the archaeological record. But it always reminds me of my own data sets, which is different because it's very alluvial environment in the Middle Euphrates. But we had the kind of same pattern in the archaeological record that for the Middle Bronze Age, we have especially these highly nucleated settlements, and the appearance that, you know, if we only had that archaeological records, we would think that population was living within the walls of nucleated settlements, fortified settlements, a handful of them throughout the valley. But we have the textual material from Mari, especially in the 18th century, that actually tells us that it's the other way around, and that most of the population presumably was living in these little hamlets of 10, 15 households that just have left no traces archaeologically, and that the big cities were that big because they were supposed to host all the countryside people when there were war. They were supposed to all gather behind the walls, but they were not residing there permanently. So how do you see that, you know, potentially being factored in the Konya Plain, which I obviously don't know at all in terms of because in the Middle Euphrates, it's clearly a factor of alluviation. It's all been buried by sediments, unlike the big tails around. So is that something that could have also played a role in Konya, or?
Well, okay, so a lot of things to answer to. Alluviation, yes. I mean, there's been a lot of sort of geoarchaeological studies in the sort of the Charshamba Delta specifically. And what they came up with is that there isn't much alluviation specifically after the early Bronze Age, after the sort of third millennium. And I was saying, because they are regimenting the flow, so there is not much flooding anymore. And also there is a probably reduced rainfall after that, and blah, blah, blah. But there isn't much alluviation. So we have maybe a meter and a half, which maybe is enough to mask very flat sites, but not enough to sort of mask more substantial villages. In addition, what we are trying to do actually through the German Aerospace Center is to sort of use a satellite imagery with pattern recognition software to also better understand these flat sites, to recognize them, recognize the anthrosol signatures, even when they're not recognizable on the field. So I will have probably a better understanding in a couple of years for that. But this is part of my project, yes.
Thanks, Michele. Mercedes, do you want to jump in? Mercedes
Yes.
Pasquale has a question.
Yeah, thank you. Very interesting. I was wondering whether in the study or in the way you will quantify these trajectories, there is. Are you looking at how the change in the environment or the change in biodiversity impacted back aspects of the cities themselves, or the settlements, or humans, diseases, whatever? I'm asking because, of course, we can think that these transitions become sustainable in these systems only because they connect increasingly to larger and larger geographic extents, becoming part of a bigger system, as the systems become locally less and less able to sustain themselves. And so I'm wondering, in lessons for today, including desert regions, but the urbanization, the so-called urbanized forest in the Amazon, how do we go from these regional studies at those times to some of the questions we have today about biodiversity, ecosystem services, etc.?
I'm not sure I understood the question.
Well, you showed us effects of changes in human society, in a sense, on biodiversity. I'm asking about changes of biodiversity back on human society, because ultimately, or at least that's part of the argument on the loss of ecosystem services and the non-sustainability of these trajectories. I was then acknowledging that, of course, there is an issue of scale, because they may have been sustainable only because they are embedded within a larger region and more connected region, so that these are not happening in isolation. But of course, the planet is limited, the Amazon is limited, etc. So I don't know whether we can see parallels, but certainly there is this idea about unsustainability of these changes to biodiversity. And I wonder in what ways these kind of archaeological studies can provide lessons for this.
Yes. I mean, actually, one of the two projects I'm co-directing is called Fragile Landscapes, is actually trying to look into the past of the Konya Plain at the sort of water management practices from the Ottoman period, so from 1500s to present, trying to see whether some of these techniques or some of this knowledge can be applied to the present to make modern farming more sustainable. So I think that there is some scope in it. I mean, we just started. We started a couple of weeks ago, so I will have to tell you more the next couple of years again. But I think that it's a bit disheartening to see that, the 60-fold increase in population, you cannot solve it simply with better agricultural techniques. I honestly don't have a solution for that. I don't think that we are beyond the point of being able to make our survival as a human species sustainable for other species. I mean, we can make it less impactful, but I think that a lot of the damage has been already done and is continuing to be done. I don't see a way of stopping, honestly. I don't see how we can go back.
I agree, we will never go back, but we cannot go forward the way we are going forward. That is clearly unsustainable at the planetary level.
Yeah.
In particular with environments like the Amazon and some of the remaining tropical forest, etc. So how to, there are certain views that already consider the Amazon as modified as an urbanized forest with a very different concept of what urbanization means. But certainly we have to consider how to whether it is possible to stop the trajectory we are in and make it. I mean, I don't think we will go back, but allowing some to preserve part of what we need to preserve for not just the local populations, but the globe. We are all in agreement about that. I was just wondering about the lessons learned on the feedbacks of biodiversity, of changing biodiversity to the trajectory you describe, right? So
yeah, I don't think I have enough data now to see how I mean, I would like to understand resilience in a lot more detail, because there is a lot of resilience, at least until the early 20th century. There are cycles of sort of collapse and regrowth, both of the environment and the sort of social complexity. But I don't have data at the moment. But this is certainly something I'm hoping to look into detail.
Great. Yeah, I think it'd be interesting to see what, there are methods of paleobiology, for example, for your lake sediments and so forth, that may allow you to reconstitute at least some picture of some parts of the ecosystem or the natural disturbed, the human disturbed system that existed through time. That might be interesting to do in your context. I don't know, Mercedes, if you have any ideas about if you have human remains or anything about diseases and pathogens, but there are ways in which sometimes people can get to some of these bits pretty hard, right?
I mean, the Turkmenkari, the second city of the Konya Plain, is where James Osborne and I would like to dig.
Right.
So again, give us a few years and we would like to, we can answer maybe a little more of these questions, but not now. We don't have enough data points at the moment.
Right. So this is the other question I had was in part, how much do you know about each one of these settlements? I think I keep asking you that question. And you gave us a sense that you have a sense of their size, spatial size, hectares, and some of their population, perhaps, at least for some. But you don't have excavations in most of them, right? You don't have detailed evidence.
No, I mean, there are excavations, let's say, covering 8,000 BC to 4,000 BC, and then that it is Çatalhöyük and other sites around. Then we have an excavation in Konya that covers 2,000 to 1,000 approximately, and then we have zero. We don't have anything else. So again, excavating Turkmenkari would allow us to go beyond that point.
Yeah, I was imagining some data on the environment that was, of course, as continuous as possible in whatever time scale, and then some, so that would be on the environment, and that something on the sort of complexity or human properties. When you say cycles, whether the cycles would be best explained with feedbacks in both directions versus just this kind of view of, okay, we are modifying the environment and it just keeps going.
Yes.
So I think something like that is doable, but of course it requires the data. It would be interesting.
Yes, indeed.
Right. So it'll be good to continue that conversation, but I think we're at time here. I think Josh Fry had a suggestion about some of the ways to be able to tell, but I asked maybe Michele, maybe you can close by saying a little bit how people can find you. This talk is also a bit of introduction to our community, but from me, just thank you very much, and let's keep in touch, and please get in touch with Michele and continue this dialogue and conversations. I think there's a lot there that's possible, and that comes out through discussions and conversations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I mean, I have an academia page, and my project website is crasp.net. Yes, thank you.